The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, I know you have some nephews and nieces that you love dearly.
Oh, yes.
Do you think those children are inherently evil?
No. No.
Well, we'll talk about that in the service, in the program this evening. Are children born in sin? Thank you for watching the program this evening. My name is Keith Sharp. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Trevor, would you please introduce yourself and tell us about Payette?
Sure will. Yeah, my name is Trevor Campbell, and I worship and preach over in Payette at the Church of Christ, located on Highway 62 in Payette. And you can't miss us. We're right on the highway on the north side next to the tractor dealership. And you'll see on the screen there our meeting times. If you'd like to come and worship with us or study with us, we have a worship at 10:45 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And you'll see a phone number on the screen there as well. That's my number. Call me at that number if you have a question for this program, or if you have a question about what we practice or what we teach or preach there at the church there in Payette.
Thank you, Trevor. And of course, my name is Keith Sharp, and I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. We have services now during the pandemic at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. We're observing all of the regulations that the governor has given, all of the suggestions that have been handed down from the governor. Try to keep ourselves safe from the coronavirus. But we meet at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning for worship and at 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening. We meet 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass on the left as you're going down towards Salesville. And we invite you to those two services, 11 o'clock Sunday morning and 7 o'clock Wednesday night. Also for our ladies, we have a 10 o'clock Wednesday morning Bible class that you're invited to. Now, this program, the subject matter is generated by questions that we receive. And we've been receiving quite a few questions. In fact, we're falling behind a little bit, so if we don't get to your question right away, we want to do a good job. We don't want to give short shrift into the questions. And we appreciate those questions. But if you have a question for us, you can call me, Keith Sharp, at 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net. Or you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. We'll be very happy to get your question and to answer it on there. And we won't say anything about who gave the question, and we won't say anything to try to run you down in any possible way. We want to be very accommodating. But all right, Trevor, we have a question before us. And that question is, let me read it as I think I received, if I remember this, it's been a while since we were given the question. I think I received this by a phone call, and I tried my best to write it down and to give it exactly as we received it. It says, was listening to your program and understand why you don't baptize kids, because they do not understand the fullness of baptism, but have to question them not having sin. My Bible tells me they were born into sin. Now, there are different times that kids come into the realization that they're sinners, but I realized this at age of 5 and repented and asked Jesus in my heart and life. Now, I believe that's how the question was posed. So, Trevor, give us one of your brilliant answers to that question, please.
Well, I appreciate the person submitting this and telling us a little bit about their story there. You know, it's mentioned in the question that their Bible says that we're born into sin. I don't know what passage they're using there. I could not find that. However, when we consider these things, you know, if we're born into sin, if all children come into this world and they're born into sin or they're born sinful, I think you have to also say that means that Jesus Christ also was born sinful. Because as I was considering these things, Jesus Christ came in the flesh. We have a record of his birth. John chapter 1 and in verse 14 says that John calls him the Word there. He calls Jesus the Word, but he says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father. And so John says he dwelt in the flesh. We have a record of his birth. Paul says he was born of a woman in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. So just like you and I, just like all of us. So when Jesus Christ came to this earth, he came to this earth in the form of flesh, put on a robe of flesh. Well, over in 1 John chapter 3, in verse 4, John says, well, he'll make a comment about Jesus here. He says, whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. And you know that he, that is Jesus, was manifested to take away our sins, and in him there is no sin. Whoever abides in him does not sin. Whoever sins has neither seen him nor known him. So what's interesting here is John says that Jesus has no sin. Earlier in John's book here in chapter 1, he talks about how God is light. And that's where Jesus is, walking in the light. And he exemplifies what it means to be in the light, to walk in the light. God is light. There's no darkness in him at all, John says earlier in John chapter 1. So God is light. There's no darkness in him. There's no sin in him. Here John makes it very clear when he says there is no sin in Jesus. So if Jesus has no sin, he came to this earth without any sin. He entered this earth without any sin. And he dwelt in the flesh without any sin. And when he became of age and to know, between good and evil and have that knowledge and understanding, he committed no sin. In fact, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15 says that he was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. So when he came to the point of time where he could decide and make choices between good and evil, he chose the good in the right way. He never committed sin. So if Jesus Christ entered this earth without sin, all children enter this earth without sin as well. They come with that same innocence. If we say that we all come in a sinful manner, then we have to say that Jesus Christ also came born into sin. And that's simply against what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that God is light. So there you go, Keith, something to start us off with there. That's something to think about.
Thank you, Trevor. As usual, in fact, as pretty much always, really good answer that I had not thought about that approach. But nonetheless, I believe it is a good approach. And although this is more or less off the cuff, I want to follow up with the approach that Trevor is using, because I do believe it's an excellent approach. Now, the argument is, and I believe Trevor is correct on this, if we are born in sin, then Jesus was born in sin. And so he had a sinful nature when he came into this world. And to emphasize that further, now Trevor read from Hebrews chapter 4 and other passages along this line, but I want to back up to Hebrews chapter 2. And to get the context, I'm going to begin reading in verse 10 and read on down to the end of the chapter. For it was fitting for him for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. Of course, Jesus is the captain of our salvation, or the leader of our salvation. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one. I believe you read further in the context. When he says they're all of one, he's saying that we're all of the same nature. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus is not divine. He is, always has been, always will be. But he took upon himself the fullness of human nature. He became the same as us in the flesh. For both he who sanctifies, and this is verse 11, and those who are being sanctified are all of one. For which reason he's not ashamed to call them brethren. He's our brother. He has the same nature we have, saying, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly I will sing praise to you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Now, all of those things show that Jesus took upon himself the same nature that we have, even to the point of trusting in God, even as we're to trust in God. Then that's verse 13. Then he goes ahead to say, inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood. Now, that phrase flesh and blood is used in the sense of a human nature. Jesus partook of the same nature we have, a human nature. He himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For indeed he does not give aid to angels, But he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. He didn't take on himself the nature of angels. He took upon himself the nature of the seed of Abraham, human nature. Verse 17 nails it down. Therefore, in all things, he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, is able to aid those who are tempted. He took upon himself all the same nature that we have. And that's the reason he could be tempted in the same way that we're tempted. And that's the reason he could become our high priest. A high priest is a merciful high priest. He sympathizes with our weaknesses because he has the same human nature that we have. Now, none of that is to deny his divine nature. Hebrews chapter 3 goes ahead to talk about his divine nature. And in Hebrews chapter 1, he gives 7 Old Testament passages that show the divine nature of Jesus. But Hebrews chapter 2 shows the human nature of Jesus. He took upon himself the same nature that we have in all things. He had to be made like his brethren. So Trevor, I believe, is 100% correct in saying that if we are born in sin, with a sinful nature, then Jesus was born the same way with a sinful nature. By the way, our Catholic friends try to get around that by talking about the Immaculate Conception and saying that Jesus of all children was the only one not born in sin. Actually, his mother Mary, they say, was also not born in sin. She was immaculately conceived. Well, where in the Scriptures do we read about any Immaculate Conception? That's not in the Bible. That's a figment of imagination. It's nowhere to be found in Scripture. It's the attempt to get around a problem that people have when they teach that humans are born in sin. Well, Trevor, I'm going to turn it back to you at this point. I've said all I want to say at this point. Thank you.
I thought that was excellent, Keith. I do want to go back just for a moment where I was at in 1 John chapter 3, where John says, he who abides in him, that is in Christ, does not sin. You know, the reason John makes that comment is because if we're actually walking in the light where Christ is in the light, God is light, God is in the light. And we see that Jesus Christ committed no sin. He was tempted as we are. As Keith showed, he had a fleshly body. He was susceptible to desires and things like that, but he committed no sin. Yet he was tempted, but without sin. Well, he walked in the light. He showed us what it means to be light. You know, when John says in 1 John chapter 1, I think it's in verse 5 there, that God is light, you know, God shows us what that means when we look at Jesus Christ and look at the life that he lived, and we look at the attributes and the character of God, we see what it means that God is light. And so, considering that, we're also to walk in the light as he is in the light where he's at. Well, if we're doing that, we're abiding in him, that's where there is no sin. We would not commit sin if we followed him to the fullest. The problem is we don't, and we make those mistakes. And sin is a conscious choice. We choose whether or not to commit sin. We make that choice. We're tempted, and actually James talks a lot about that, and hopefully we'll have time to look at that this evening. James talks about the step-by-step process, so to speak, from temptation to sin. We must first be tempted before we're guilty of any sin. We make that choice to sin, that is. But going back to Jesus walking in the light, if that's where we're at, and we really understand who Jesus is and what he expects of us, and we follow his commands, then we're walking in the light, and we're not guilty of sin. When we commit sin is when we make the choice to step away from the program, so to speak, to stop doing as God has instructed us to do. I guess I can go to James chapter 1. Keith, if that's all right with you.
By all means.
I'm going to go to James chapter 1, since I brought it up here. James talks about sort of a step-by-step process here of how we're tempted and tested, and then when we give in to that temptation, we sin. In James chapter 1 and verse 12, he says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone." So what he's in essence saying there is it would be evil for God to tempt someone. He does not do that. He cannot be tempted to do evil. He cannot be tempted in any way. And so he does not tempt us. in verse 14, he says, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed." So we have to understand, first of all, when we're tempted, it's because we've been drawn away by our own desires. We've been enticed. You know, there are all things that we each of us struggle with. There are certain temptations we may struggle with. Not all of us have the same temptations. There are certain sins that don't tempt me at all. I don't even think about them. I'm not interested in committing those things. There are other things that do trouble me and bother me. And so those are the things I have to deal with and work with. So each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. And so there's the process that James gives us. No one is born into sin. No one has sin at their birth, but rather when we come to a point in which we can be tempted, and we have our desires and we're drawn away by those desires, and we're enticed, and then we commit sin, now we're guilty, and now we're guilty of sin. So I'll turn it back to you.
Very good. So sin is not something we're born into. Sin is what we do. We're accountable for our own actions. There's many passages I would like to get to as we have time, but I want to leave this train of thought for a moment and turn to a passage that is probably the most commonly used passage to teach that children are born in sin. That is, that they're born with a sinful nature. And that's a statement that David makes in Psalm 51, verse 5, where he says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." Now, there's many different ways, or several different ways we could interpret that passage other than saying that David was born with a sinful nature. One is, and this may be the right interpretation, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it, is that David is using, and he does this. Remember, the Psalms are the poetry of the Jewish people. David was a poet. Poets use figures of speech. That's one of the primary characteristics of poetry, is figures of speech rather than all the language being literal. We need to realize that. And so he was probably using the figure of speech called hyperbole, where he intentionally overstates something in order to emphasize his own sinfulness. And this may be what David was doing. At the time when he had committed adultery with Bathsheba, at the time when he'd had her husband Uriah put to death, he was guilty of lusting after another man's wife. He was guilty of adultery. He was guilty of murder. He had violated 3 of the 10 commandments. And 2 of those violations carried the death penalty under the law of Moses, adultery and murder. And so he realized his own extreme sinfulness in what he had done. So probably David is using a figure of speech called hyperbole, where he intentionally exaggerates the guilt to drive home the fact he's very, very aware of the extreme nature of his guilt. God, of course, forgave him because he repented and asked God to forgive him. So this, I believe, is the easy way to take that, just simply as David using hyperbole. And he does that several other times in the Psalms that we can point out. But I'll stop there for right now and let Trevor make some comments on this if he would like to.
Well, I thought that was good, Keith. I like that alternate view. I had always viewed this as he's saying that his mother was also sinful, and that's the way I took it. But either way, it does make sense. But talking about, innocence of children, we went to this passage about David. Back over in Deuteronomy chapter 1, the people had sinned in the wilderness, the Israelites that is, and because of their sin, they were not allowed to enter into the promised land, the land of Canaan that God had promised them. And this all came about, there were a number of sins that were committed, but they had sent in 12 spies to spy out the land of Canaan. 10 spies came back with a bad report saying, we can't take it, the people are too big for us, and too mighty, and we just can't do it. And so all the people got discouraged, started crying, said, we can't do it. Well, there was Joshua and Caleb, 2 spies that also went in, and they said, the Lord is giving us this land, we can take this land. And I'm paraphrasing, but that was the basis of basically the story there. And so those people who refused to go into the land and thought that they had lost faith, they didn't have faith in God that they could go into the land and take the land of Canaan, Well, those individuals were not allowed to enter it later on. But God did allow their young ones, who later on would have grown up and were adults at that time, to enter the land of Canaan. In chapter 1 and verse 39, God says, "Moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be victims today, who have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess it." All right, so what the people were saying is, our children are victims. They had no fault. They weren't part of this sin. And God agrees with that. And God says today they have no knowledge of good or evil. So I think that's important when we consider whether or not children are sinful. You know, here's God saying these children have no knowledge of good or evil. They would have been victims in this case. They're not guilty of that same sin that their parents committed. And so they are allowed to enter into that promised land.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Good comments. There's a number of other passages in both Old Testament and New Testament that emphasize the innocence of children. But I want to once again look at another passage that is used by those people who believe that children are born in sin, that is, born with a sinful nature and inherit the guilt of Adam's sin. That's the belief that is very common, has been for a number of years, and see if they actually uphold that. Over in Psalm 58, verse 3, and again, this is a psalm of David. Remember the figurative nature of the things that David says. He's a poet. He's writing the way poets write. "The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies." Now, if this is to be taken literally, think about two things. First of all, he says that they're estranged from the womb, but then he says they go astray. Well, if they're born astray, how do they go astray? How can you go away from righteousness to wickedness if you're born in wickedness? And so I believe that in and of itself shows he's not using literal language. But another thing is, he says, as soon as they're born, speaking lies. What lies do little infants who are unable to speak? Now, believe it or not, I've heard an answer to that. I've heard people say, well, when they cry and you can't find anything wrong with them, then they're lying to you. I'm sorry, I view that as a humorous statement. When a little child cries, all that little child is telling you, he's unhappy. He doesn't know what makes him unhappy. He just knows he's unhappy. He's not lying to you. He's telling you the truth. He's unhappy, and he wants you to do something about it. So I view that as an absurdity. I believe it is an absurdity. So again, a figure of speech that people are pressing in a way that it was a hyperbole, that David never intended to use it. He's talking about how wicked the sinners were in his generation. Well, Trevor, we have a few minutes left in the program, so I'm going to let you say some more about that if you'd like.
All right, sure. Well, I had written down a couple of passages myself, not that are misunderstood passages, pretty simple passages, I believe, concerning just the innocence of children. And just to kind of drive that point, in Jeremiah chapter 19, Jeremiah chapter 19, now God here is recounting some of the sins of the people of Israel. One of the sins that they committed was that they had begun offering their children to idols, to false gods, in a false form of worship that they had seen and picked up from the surrounding peoples, the nations. And this is obviously not something God had wanted them to do, wasn't to be part of their worship at all. And in verse 4 of Jeremiah 19, he says, "Because they have forsaken me," that's the Israelites, "and made this an alien place, because they have burned incense in it to other gods, whom neither they, their fathers, nor the kings of Judah have known, and have filled this place with the blood of the innocents. They have also built the high places of Baal, to burn their sons with fire for burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or speak, nor did it come into my mind," God says. All right, so he here refers to the children, and I like what he says. He calls it the blood of the innocents that was shed there. He calls them the innocents, and it's plural there, talking about innocent children. So that's just one more example right there concerning children being innocent, Keith.
Real good, Trevor. Well, all right. We have a few minutes left in the program, so I'm going to introduce one more passage that is used to teach that children are born in sin, and show you why I believe that passage is being misused. Look at Psalm 14, verses 2 and 3. Psalm 14, verses 2 and 3. The Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men. Notice that's not necessarily talking about little children. That's just a figurative way of saying men. To see if there are any who understand, who seek God. They have all turned aside. Notice he doesn't say they're born aside. He said they've turned aside. They have together become corrupt. He doesn't say they're born corrupt. He says they've become corrupt. There's none who does good, no, not one. Now that's an obvious example of hyperbole, an intentional exaggeration to drive home a point. If it is the exact literal case of the matter, there's none good, no, not one, then David, the author of the psalm, was himself evil. And of course, he was a man of God. So certainly the passages that are used to show that children are born in sin are misused passages. Well, Trevor, we have about 3 minutes left in the program. You want to take the time to introduce another passage?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Matthew chapter 18, I think, is a good passage. And again, like I said, I had just written down some passages showing the innocence of children. And I think this passage speaks to that as well. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is dealing with attitudes. And dealing with, he's talking to his disciples specifically, but it's also for all of us to consider our own attitudes and talking about humility. And one of the things that he says is that we have to convert, that is change our minds and hearts, and become as little children. And what he's talking about is that innocence and that humility that children have. It says in chapter 18 of Matthew in verse 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Well, so their attitude right off the bat is wrong. They're wanting to be the great ones, the greatest. Who's going to be the greatest? And that sometimes is in the minds of the disciples. We see, as it's recorded for us, there were times when they even bickered about who was going to be greater in the kingdom of heaven. They were kind of disputing amongst themselves. Well, in verse 2, Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And he goes on from there, but talking about attitude. So he's dealing with putting away pride and arrogance and those sort of things, and putting on a humble spirit and being likened unto be like a child, to convert and change. Well, if children are sinful, I don't know why Jesus would use them as the example and say that you need to become like this vile, sinful little child. That just doesn't make any sense to me. What he's doing is taking one who is completely innocent and saying, this is what you need to be like. And this is where you need to change. Because as we grow up and we become older and of age to understand good and evil, that's when we begin to make our mistakes. And that's when we begin to be drawn away, as James said, by our own desires, enticed, we give in to temptation, and we sin. Children aren't guilty of sin. Those who understand the difference between good and evil and have a solid knowledge of that, those are the ones who make the choice of whether or not to sin. And that would be people who are older, not children.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Excellent answers. Well, Trevor, we're about out of time. Tell me something. How can people be in touch with you to let you know their questions?
Sure, yeah. You can contact me by phone. The number is 870-435-2737. And if you have a question for the program, give me a call there.
And you can call me also, and I'll be glad to receive your questions. Thanks so much for watching this evening. Please watch next time. Bye.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.